You're listening to A Deeper Dive, a part of the Winsight Podcast Network.
Hello, this is Jonathan Mays, Editor-in-Chief of Restaurant Business, and in this week's episode of A Deeper Dive, I speak with Peter Romeo, the Editor-at-Large of RB, to talk about some of the rather colorful events in the industry's history. Peter is the host of the RB podcast, Restaurant Rewind, and is the unofficial historian of the restaurant business, or maybe the official at this point. He's so old. And I thought I would tap into that historic knowledge to chat about some of the more notable frauds and accounting situations in the industry. We talk about Buca de Beppo, for instance, and its Italian villa and strip club payments. We also talk about the accounting errors that led to serious problems at Krispy Kreme 20 years ago. And we talk about some smaller frauds like the guy in Michigan who used his company's loyalty program to take from the till. And my personal favorite, the restaurant in California who used a fake priest to elicit confessions of wrongdoing from its employees. We're talking fraud on A Deeper Dive, so please have a listen. All right, I am here with Peter Romeo. Peter, welcome again to the podcast.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good to be back with you here.
Awesome. So I was, sir, reminded of one little fact about the restaurant industry recently, that it tends to attract perhaps a bit more of its share of, say, fraudulent activities than maybe other industries. I don't know how true that is, but sometimes it seems like it. And so that got me thinking, you know what? I'm going to demand Peter be on the podcast and hit him with questions about this sort of thing, because if you look back in history, there's some pretty interesting examples, don't you think?
Oh, no doubt about it. You know, but the nature of the industry, so many transactions are done now on credit cards, but that's a relatively recent thing. And so all that cash and all the kind of nonconformists who were in the industry who kind of fell into it, you had those things together, and indeed, we've seen some incredible situations, but just day in and day out, rank and file. There was a time in the 70s and 80s where you would have been hard pressed to find an independent restaurant that didn't have two sets of books, one for the IRS and one that was the real results. And so, yeah, it's definitely lent it, but we have seen some amazing things. The one that really jumps out, Buca de Beppo was kind of a conservative chain in your city there, based in your city. And lo and behold, it comes out that somehow there were some shenanigans that came up about things as routine as who owned a property that had opened in Italy to study Italian cuisine. Now, why it needed a villa in Tuscany, why Buca de Beppo needed one, has always been kind of a mystery, but lo and behold, it kind of turns out that the name on the lease for this study center that they opened in Italy was in the name of their then CEO. And that was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of things that happened. It came out afterwards that the CEO, who was still in the industry, he had apparently used a corporate credit card to pay for his son's bachelor party. There were all kinds of shenanigans like that. To make a long story short, it resulted in some jail time for Joe Micatrato. The thing that I remember that was just really insane was that at the time he was the treasurer of the National Restaurant Association's Educational Foundation, and here he was accused and found guilty of diverting some money. Now, that having been said, I'm a firm believer that you do your time, you wipe the slate clean. And Joe is still around, and he's a Raising Cane's franchisee and doing quite well. And I'm sure realized the error of his ways. But that's just a start. One of the more conservative, one of the more stable organizations has always been Whataburger. And they had a CEO who was just a revered figure in the industry. And lo and behold, it came out that he had been sharing or the accusations were that he had been sharing in the money that Coca-Cola was paying the chain to use Coca-Cola. and it led to his exit. It led to a terrible situation. I don't think that there was ever any court action, but certainly those accusations have flown, and it wasn't the first and only time that there have been assertions that CEOs might have shared in promotional funds that were meant for franchisees. So yeah, there's a lot of real arcane things. There's a lot of real high profile things. There's always been that temptation for sure.
Yeah. Wasn't on the Buca thing, didn't they pay for visits to strip clubs?
Yeah. They were using the corporate card, and it wasn't even sort of like this was not a Sherlock Holmes situation. It really wasn't hard to figure this out. It was really a matter of what was covered and what was not. And the assertions that these were business endeavors kind of were easily misproved. And Joe did 13 months in jail, and they had to bring in a guy with the whitest hat, the fellow who wears the whitest hat I know, Wally Doolin, to come in as CEO and chairman to clean that up. And he said he walked in there, and here his top two officers in the chain had been sent to jail. So it's an interesting situation, to say the least. But there have been lots of instances of that. There was a time when all of a sudden the IRS started taking a hard look at the use of corporate planes. And one of the things that they flagged that a disgruntled shareholder of Applebee's found out was that the CEO was flying executives down to Corpus Christi for business meetings and site inspections, going to visit restaurants. Well, it turns out there was no restaurant within 250 miles of where they were going. And that led to some interesting discussions and helped usher that CEO out of the seat and a new one into it. And there have been innumerable instances of things like that where there was misuse of the plane alleged. It cost Red Robin CEO his job. It hurt a guy who owned Perkins and one of the other family chains. So we've seen that repeatedly. That's been a real common sort of area of abuse for sure.
Yeah. It's, to me, there's like a big difference between, using the company plane and that sort of thing. All kinds of major chains have, corporate plane usage, and then they record it and, things of that nature. And certainly a lot of companies, I probably, if I'm a shareholder, want my CEO. Like if I'm a shareholder at McDonald's, well, I guess if I hold a mutual fund, I probably am a shareholder at McDonald's technically. But if I'm a shareholder at McDonald's, I probably want, Chris Kempczinski taking a private jet, because I don't want that guy flying with anybody else, but, given certain issues. But, you can see where that over the years has caused some issues on things like that. The thing about the strip club issue is I'm trying to imagine how our bosses would react if somehow I put a strip club in my expense report. I've never understood quite the gall of some people of doing anything of that nature. Is one always just trying to imagine that, just weird.
Well, one of the things about the restaurant industry is it's really kind of a cradle of creativity. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about covering it. You get these folks who come at things differently, and so you have that innovation. Well, unfortunately, that's not always put to good use. And then you have these people who use their creativity to figure out new ways of beating the system. So just recently, we had the fellow who had run two pizzerias in Michigan for 30 years, since the day they opened. And he figured out a way to scam, and he pled guilty to this. So it's not, it's beyond the assertion stage. Figured out a way how to scam the frequent guest program, where he would go back in and reclassify certain transactions as reimbursements for freebies given away, earned by the customer through the frequent guest program. And since they were designated that way, there was excess money in the till because the money had been collected for those items. And so he would just take that money. And it was 130,000 over, I believe, 4 years that he did it. And it was pretty clever. Now, you and I have gone back and forth. How clever was it? He got caught. And that's a really interesting question because it begs the possibility that there's a lot more out there that we never even know about where people are not caught. So, that was that was kind of one of the common ones. The other thing is that you see these situations where family members are sometimes listed on listed in the corporate role of employees and positions that I've never heard of. We had a situation out here where in Long Island where a restaurateur was trying to curry favor with a politician, and wasn't the restaurateur's relative, but the politician's relative, was given the job for a 1-unit operation of taster for $125,000 a year.
Wow.
So where there's a will, there's a way, for sure.
Now, that kind of sounds like your job description.
Yeah, well, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I'm trying to get that really in-depth look at prison feeding for our sister publication, Food Service Director. So
yeah, nice plug for FSD. Yeah, that's kind of funny. Like you mentioned that, like Big Laurie Holdings, run by one Sardar Big Laurie, has employed a couple of his family members. Now, I do not believe that they have the creative titles to that extent. I mean, I think there's like one, his father is a consultant or has been, and I believe his brothers worked at the company as well, and things like that. And given really nice 6-figure paydays and things of that nature, but again, that's one of those things. At what point, I mean, you see, the family members work all the time, and especially if you go into some of these private chains, there are family members all over the place. And at what point is it just sort of the family business? But I mean, there are certain situations like that. I want to get into another situation. If you recall, you might have heard of this chain called Krispy Kreme.
Oh yeah, one of the great scandals of our time, because it wasn't even subtle. It wasn't even sort of well hidden. If I recall correctly, the management was basically jiggering the numbers so that they beat the earnings estimate by a penny each and every quarter. And that figured into their bonuses and made them such a darling of Wall Street when it was all a house of cards. And, it's kind of a Ponzi scheme where, Ponzi schemes can keep going as long as they keep going. But then somehow it comes to the light and it all falls apart. And with Krispy Kreme, it did come. And they had such a highly regarded CEO and kind of this darling of Wall Street. And he was ousted. I don't believe charges were ever brought or if it was that severe, but certainly it was a big deal.
Yeah, they were, I'm reading here, is like $25.6 million in bad accounting, and I mean, as you recall, Krispy Kreme was their decision to expand beyond the Southeast was heralded. And then they would open these gigantic donut making factories, and people get very excited for very good reason. I mean, Krispy Kreme donuts are amazing. So, I mean, I think in your neck of the woods, New York, it was, there was huge lines everywhere. And then as it turned out, they had to fake the numbers, and probably more and more as time went on, because the thing is, like, you can only eat so many donuts, and they could not support. So they had this really bad combination of sort of a bad business model that didn't work very well, because, you can't live off your initial excitement, and eventually you got to figure out a way to pay for your big buildings. So they badly overestimated how popular their donuts would be over time. And then plus they were faking the numbers. And so they probably had to fake numbers more and more as things got worse. And eventually things find out. That is a classic example, by the way, what you mean. And them in the Michigan scenario of stupid, if you're going to fake it, you got to at least make it look random. You can't make it look like it's, beating it by a penny every single time just automatically seems suspicious to me. You know what? Throw in a loss on occasion. That's my advice to you. If you're going to do some accounting scandals, you know what? Miss earnings on occasion. And then you got to have to make it random.
Well, one of the ironies with Krispy Kreme was then it was acquired by JAB Holdings. And JAB Holdings, we're not that familiar with the corporate entity here in the U.S., but in Europe, it's very well known as a major chemical supplier. And that was where it made its money initially. And it made its money. It came to fore in the 20s and was in Germany in the 30s. And recently, to their credit, maybe within the last 4 or 5 years, the executives just said, let's look back and look at our history and what our family predecessors did during World War II. And it came out that they were very active in the Nazi Party. And rather than hide it, the family that runs JAB came out with that information. They actually paid for a study to be done to sort of quantify the actions of their predecessors, and cooperated with Der Spiegel, the worldwide magazine, to talk about it. So it was as if they discovered something in their past that wasn't relevant to that day, but they wanted to basically come clean about it and to say how wrong this was. So, I mean, it was the exact opposite of what Krispy Kreme did. It was transparency in its best form.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. And JAB bought a bunch of restaurants there for a while. Been rather quiet for a long time, but they bought Panera and Caribou, and Pete's, and all these other companies, and they've taken, I think, Pete's public with merger with. I'm blanking out, but we took Krispy Kreme public, and they're itchy to take Panera Brands public after merging it with Caribou and stuff like that. But yeah. Doing something like that is not, to me, that is exactly how you respond to a situation like that. And that is a textbook example. If you're confronted with some news like that, go back and acknowledge the issue, and then, take steps to make up for it to the extent that you can. Not like you can, especially in something like that. But, that to me is the best thing to the best strategy.
And maybe it wasn't textbook perfect, but what McDonald's did when it came out that their highly regarded CEO, Steve Easterbrook, was engaging in activity that was beyond the pale in terms of with female employees. And at least they came out and said what was what, rather than trying to sweep it aside. I think you and I, if we put our heads together, could name other situations where perhaps the CEO or senior executives weren't behaving as they should, and basically they were just shown the door and nothing was said about it. And a lot of children born out of wedlock to some of the most esteemed CEOs in the business that never came to the fore. So,
yeah, might have heard of a few of those scenarios. Maybe we bring up the McDonald's situation, and that was one of the crazier things I personally covered. I was at the gym at the time, and then I get and it was Sunday. It was Sunday, for God's sakes. You're doing this on a Sunday to me. It's unfair. I'm trying to finish my weekend here and get a workout in. Anyway, so I'm at the gym, and I get an email, and because I just habitually check my email while I'm at the gym, and said, we got a story for you embargoed for 30 minutes into the future. I'm like, what? 30, what? You're giving me that? So I bolt. I just take off, and I bolt home. The gym's not that far from my house. And, of course, find out that Steve Easterbrook was replaced by Chris Kempczinski for an inappropriate relationship, and then as we found out later, it got worse and worse, and then they did not do that perfectly. Certainly, if you ask shareholders and some others, but eventually they went and clawed back like $100 million worth of stock and whatnot after discovering some additional relationships that they had that he'd had with employees, stuff like that, and tended to operate things like a sort of a frat house, I guess, type pub atmosphere. Just and that, to your point, the restaurant industry, and I think this gets to kind of the whole issue here, is that the restaurant industry is it's full of a lot of interesting characters who live very hard lives and work long hours. They often work very late, and things of that nature. And, they end up being put into scenarios and sort of living, sort of lives that end up put themselves in a position to end up with situations like this. And most of the time, unlike this, it gets swept under the rug.
Mm-hmm. And we've been around long enough to see so many of those conceding to temptation, people just not being able to say no. And sometimes those are minor things. We had a situation at one point where a very highly regarded executive gave us his resume for a profile, and looking at it, it was very obvious to us as students of the industry that he had lied, that there were things on there that he had never done. But someone who wasn't perhaps as attuned to the industry as we were would not get that. And so we confronted him, and the poor guy cried, begging us not to let this be known. But, and in the scheme of things, it was probably, it's not a crime. But you get those situations, or you find out that someone is not as above board as they should be in terms of their personal lives or their personal dealings. And so you have all those kinds of things as well. So, it's the industry. The flip side of having an industry of entrepreneurs is that you get a lot of loose cannons that can go afoul of the law for sure. Thank God it's not like journalism where we're all angels.
Yes, exactly. We are definitely all angels. It is a bad idea, by the way, to give a journalist a bad resume. Just don't do it. You know what? If you're going to do that, if you're going to give a person or group of people whose job it is to question everything and to look up information on people, resumes with holes, just don't. That's just a bad idea all around.
Yeah, you fall in love with your own abilities and you think you're invulnerable or you can fool the world. And that just doesn't happen, especially now in this day and age where there's so much on the internet that you can dig up. It's kind of insane, but it still happens, as we've indicated with our recent coverage. We also had the two restaurants out in California that wanted to get the temperature of their employees. So they figured that they would hire a guy, tell everyone he was a priest, and he would ask for their confessions. And when the employees weren't forthcoming, he started asking pointed questions. Well, have you ever cheated? Have you ever taken money? Have you ever clocked in late or early, or had someone clock in for you? And it was obvious to the employees that this was no priest. So we'll continue to see situations, and technology lends itself to some misuse, as that general manager in Michigan showed. So I think we'll continue to see more of these for sure. Those shareholders are certainly more attuned to that and more willing to blow the whistle on suspected misbehavior than perhaps they were 30 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's too much information available for people to easily get away with that. But I'm trying to think of like what was the decision-making process to say, hey, look, to capture, to catch these people doing wrong, we're gonna hire a fake priest. Who does that? I mean, he does get points for creativity. I'll give him that.
But what an elaborate thing, rather than sort of going to your employees and saying, look, what are we doing wrong? What do you dislike? What can we do differently? Subterfuge they probably could have arrived at the same end without any subterfuge and spared themselves from running afoul of federal regulators as well as their own employees. But there's a ton of stuff like that for sure. So.
Yeah. Why not do the old-fashioned thing and just pit employees against one another like they used to? Or do you have to,
or the common one used to be the bartenders, because most bars are still free pours. There's not that much metering of drinks. They would basically just, instead of getting 5 drinks out of a bottle or 20 drinks out of a bottle, they would get 25. And they would pocket the difference. And that was such a common thing. It reminds me of when I was a kid, some buddies worked in the movie theater, and they would not rip up the tickets that you bought from the ticket seller. And then they would resell them. And of course, that money was there. So there was a ton of stuff like that for sure. There have been some well-publicized cases of people stealing food too. That was an issue for some big name steakhouses. One in New York, I remember eating there with the proprietor, and somehow it coming to light while we were there that an employee had walked out with 2 or 3 steaks, and there was hell to pay for sure. So
back in the day, and I think the statute of limitations is probably passing this. I worked at McDonald's back in the day, and I had a couple of friends that did this. They were roommates. And both were managers at this, assistant managers at this McDonald's that I worked at. And they would make tacos from the food that they stole from McDonald's. They basically ate, and then made their own different recipes because, you can only eat burgers so much. But yeah, they would take hamburger patties and lettuce and all that other stuff. And then they would make food with it. That was very common. I mean, it wasn't, so things like that, they would just steal stuff.
Oh yeah, and there was a rash of it still flares up from time to time, but of restaurants selling their used fryer oil. They sell it to other companies and it's repurposed as soap or used for whatever. Mm-hmm. And once employees found out that was the case, they would ride that gravy train. And so there was a period where that was so rampant in the industry that they started cracking down on it. Things like locking the port outside or the tank outside where they'd put the oil for someone to just come and pick it up instead of just coming and just helping themselves. These recovery companies, they didn't need a key. We're always playing catch up with the bad guys is what it comes down to.
And a lot of times the bad guys are inside the restaurant, sir. Always wonderful having you on, Peter.
Well, it's great to talk about crime because I know that's one of your, areas of interest.
Love me some crime.
And I see you're wearing the shirt with the name of one of your kids on there, Ebida.
Yeah, that's my second child is named Ebida.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So. Well, it's always a delight, especially to talk about this topic because it's so rich and colorful, and God only knows how deep it goes. But it's unfortunately something our industry invites and probably will continue to long after we're retired or we're rocking on the front porch of Shady Acres. So
yeah. And that should do it for this week's episode of A Deeper Dive, which was edited, as always, by Kimmy Spoons Kazmarek, artwork by Nico Hines. You may find this and other episodes of the podcast on our website at www.restaurantbusinessonline.com/article/deeper-dive. And you may find them on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else you get these fancy listening shows. I am Jonathan Mays, your host, podcast producer, and the editor-in-chief of Restaurant Business. Thank you for listening.